Good morning, everybody, and Happy New Year, as the case may be. Welcome to our first United States Study Center webinar for 2021. I'm Simon Jackman, Professor of Political Science at the University of Sydney and the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney. And the University of Sydney stands on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today's event takes place less than 24 hours before the inauguration of Joe Biden as America's 46th president. It's already Wednesday, the 20th here in Australia. At about, what will it be, about 4 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time tomorrow morning, Thursday, Biden will be sworn in. Today, we're joined by three of my colleagues from the United States Study Center to talk through what we billed originally as key players in the Biden administration. But as we'll break up our time today, not talking about the momentous events of the last fortnight or so in the United States, is the proverbial elephant in the living room, so to speak. So we will no doubt talk about that. And indeed, there's an obvious and rather direct connection between those events and the sorts of policies and politics we'll get out of these opening hours, days, weeks, and months of this Biden administration. To join me today to talk about all of that, I'm joined by, as I said, three of our colleagues. First of all, Gorana Grigic, who is jointly appointed between the United States Study Center and the university, where she has a position in the Department of Government and International Relations. Gorana is also holds an adjunct appointment through the good graces of our sister center, the Perth US Asia Center at the University of Western Australia. Gorana's spent time at Harvard, and I'm sad to say is leaving us to go to Rome, but only for a little while, only for 6 months or so, where she'll be at the NATO Defense College, which is a really super well-timed appointment given the Biden administration's stated goal of a restoration of sort of normal transmission when it comes to European allies in particular. So that's something where Gorana's fellowship will serve her and the United States Study Center and our mission greatly. Great to have Gorana with us. Joining us from Canberra is Jen Hunt, who's a lecturer in national security at the Crawford School of Public Policy at Australian National University. And she is, of course, a non-resident fellow with us at the US Study Center. Jen specializes in the national security of critical systems, including energy and cyber, and has done a lot of work on disinformation. Her latest report, The COVID-19 Pandemic and Post-Truth, which was released through the Global Health Security Network, looks at COVID-19 disinformation and conspiracy theories and their longer-term implications. And of course, for that reason, we thought Jen would be a superb participant in today's event that, as I said, has a slightly retrospective frame as well as a prospective one. And last but by no means least, from Balmain, we're joined by Bruce Volpe.
The People's Republic.
And the People's Republic of Balmain. So the Birch Grove people are splitters, are they? Yeah. But anyway, Bruce is a non-resident senior fellow at the US Study Center, and quite simply knows more about the US Congress than anyone. I think I can say that with a great deal of confidence, than anyone in Australia. Bruce worked on Capitol Hill for a good while. And the last time we had a Democratic president and a Democratic House. And Bruce brings tremendous expertise and insight as to what's going to happen on Capitol Hill, both in the very near term, but also in the longer term under this Biden administration, where, of course, the surprise that the Democrats will have a barely working majority in the United States Senate, delivers all three branches, the two legislative chambers, and of course the executive branch, to Democrats. And that's why Bruce's expertise is going to be so important for this conversation, but also the many conversations the United States Study Center will be brokering over the next little while. So thank you all for joining us from Canberra, the People's Republic of Balmain, and Garana from the other side of the building at the United States Study Center. Good morning to you all.
Good morning, Simon. Thanks.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hi. Hey, look, I'm wondering if we could start with some reflections from each of you over what we've witnessed over the last week or so. I said it's impossible to have a conversation, I think, about what we're likely to see unfold in this opening stanza of the Biden administration without some sort of reflection on the events of the last couple of weeks, and you might even say the last couple of months, and you might say the last 4 or 5 years as well. But Jen, I wonder if I might come to you to begin with, the role that disinformation played over the Trump presidency, but perhaps its very catalytic effect over the last couple of months leading to that remarkable storming of the Capitol on only a week or two ago now, January 6th, the day to sort of see it into our memories now. Have we seen the high watermark now that Trump is off Twitter, that Trump is going off to Mar-a-Lago, some of the distance that you see, some sort of, hitherto they used to be called mainstream Republicans, look to be putting between themselves and the outgoing president? I'm wondering if you could just sort of share some reflections based on your own work and your own thinking on that proposition.
Sure. Thanks, Simon, so much for the invite. It's good to be back. So remember in the 2017 inauguration of Trump, this is when we had the introduction of that famous phrase, alternative facts. And I think the last 4 years have really demonstrated their deadly consequences. We have disinformation and conspiracy theories about COVID-19, which has thus far cost 400,000 lives in the United States. In fact, right now, President-elect Biden is at the reflection pool in DC commemorating those lives. And we also saw Trump as conspiracy theorist in chief, who started his campaign with a conspiracy theory about the eligibility of President Barack Obama. We saw him end his presidency on a conspiracy theory as well, that any contest he loses must be fraudulent. Anything from the Emmys to national elections. And that also had deadly consequences. 5 lives at the Capitol building were lost, a 6th by suicide. That was a Capitol police officer. And I think that we're continuing to see his legacy. Even though it is a bit quieter on Twitter and social media and Facebook, you have a group of Republicans that have followed that template to mainstream conspiracy theories for naked political gain. You have 2 members of QAnon that have been elected to Congress, and Congress now has protective measures in place against themselves. We now have metal detectors inside the halls of Congress for members to go through after several Republican members insisted on carrying firearms. We now have a mask mandate inside Congress for other Congress members after everyone sheltered together in place and some Republican members refused to wear a mask during those attacks. Subsequently, 3 Democratic legislative members have now come down with COVID-19. And we have fines that have been levied because members indicated they wouldn't follow those rules in the interest of public health and safety. So I think the legacy of Trump will live on beyond his tenure. This won't only be a 4-year saga. But we have members of the party who have demonstrated the electoral success of this strategy. And for those of you who are blessedly unaware of QAnon, QAnon was declared a conspiracy-driven domestic terror threat by the FBI in 2019. It posits that anyone who is against Trump is part of a secret deep state cabal of sex traffickers. I think Alex Jones, one of the conspiracy theorists online, whom Trump personally called in to congratulate for his support, I think he's noted that some of those sex colonies might be on Mars. So this will impact policymaking for years to come. These are the people that are making decisions about apportionment of resources, how we fight global and national challenges. And I think that legacy will be very difficult to dislodge from the GOP without strong action through a conviction and barring from office.
Garana, I'm wondering if I could turn to you to get your reactions to anything that Jen said. Just, I know, like myself, you know, we're doing a ton of media on this, and even just dealing with the Uber driver or whatever it might be. How is American democracy out of the woods? This is a question I get from family members, from ordinary people, you know, acquaintances, you know, civilians, you might say, as well as journalists. How is this the opening stanza? Is the disinformation wave cresting and now receding? Or is there still, you know, a real sort of danger of further incidents like the one we saw at the Capitol? I'm wondering your assessment of sort of the enormity or the magnitude, don't want to put words in your mouth, of what we saw a couple of weeks ago, and what it might portend for sort of that stability of the system, if you will, before we get into the specifics of more mundane things like Biden policy and appointments.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And it's great to be with all of you. As Simon said, I am reporting from the other end of the building and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on which University of Sydney stands. So what I make of the past couple of weeks is certainly that these events will seal Donald Trump's legacy. There's no doubt about that. What we've seen is US democracy, both figuratively and literally, under siege with the insurrectionists that attacked the Capitol building. And indeed, as Jen said, it all does feel like it's coming full circle. The presidency that began with a talk of carnage and alternative facts ends with basically bloodshed and again, this story of the big lie over the 2020 election results. But what strikes me the most, and that goes to your question, Simon, around the state of American democracy, and I can't help but think of Schrodinger's cat, you know, the kind of this property of something being both alive and dead at the same time. And obviously I'm not a quantum physics expert and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but it seems to me that at the same time, while we had various data points that showed that democracy survived and that the system held, we have to remember that the voter turnout in 2020 election was at record levels, that ultimately transition did happen. While Donald Trump hasn't formally conceded yet, this process is now coming to an end. Obviously, we are going to see the inauguration of the 46th president and ultimately the certification of votes in the Congress at the Capitol resumed after the whole building was overrun by insurrectionists. But at the same time, obviously, we have this big question around what do you do when you have 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump, out of which about half probably on any given day believe that there were some issues with that election, that basically either Donald Trump rightfully won or that there were issues with electoral integrity, that a number of, again, Republican voters believe that the system is rigged, that it was skewed towards Democrats. And also, what do you do again in a system where we have the Electoral College produce the same number of votes, right? But obviously now with popular vote going with the Electoral College vote, and the margin actually that we had from Clinton, 3 million to now Biden, around 7 million, still gives us this sort of situation where if we scrambled the 100,000 votes differently around some of these critical battleground states, we might have seen a different result with the Electoral College altogether. So going back to that earlier point, you know, democracy still alive if you think about, you know, political participation and competition despite all the obstacles, but at the same time still predicated on a system that could have, you know, been could have produced a much different result. And one final thing for political science nerds out there, we entered the 2020 with the Polity score for the United States, designating the United States for the first time in its history as an anocracy. Now, obviously, these various indicators of the health of democracy are problematic because, you know, back in 19th century, they would have deemed the United States to be a liberal democracy when it clearly wasn't that, if you think about half of the voting population actually not being able to exercise franchise. But at the same time, you know, to just ponder on that thought that the United States, given everything what's been happening over the past 4 years, but especially over the past month or so, has now been designated as a regime that's somewhere in between a democracy and an autocracy.
Thanks, Gorana, for that. And yeah, yesterday, for those of you that traffic in political science Twitter, there's been a quite lively a little bit of back and forth, and indeed triggered by an essay in, I think it was Foreign Affairs, on exactly these coding schemes that the international political science community uses for classifying regimes. And there's a very lively debate as to what constitutes a democracy. We should probably reserve that for another webinar, frankly. I think this episode, I might get Bruce to sort of weigh in on this. This entire episode, I think, does raise some really deep and profound questions, suffice to say, to put it rather blandly, about the state of American democracy. Gorana, I loved Schrodinger's cat as a metaphor for the ambivalence, right? American democracy being in two states at once: one crisis, and this tenuous sort of nature of it, but the other being quite robust. And I think, as you rightly point out, the voter turnout, the fact that the judicial institutions did not intervene on behalf of the president, despite 60 and plus cases that were brought after the election, to say nothing of the literally hundreds that were brought before. To some extent, and we are yet to have that transition of power yet. And that'll be noon Washington time tomorrow, and I guess from in a de facto sense, an administration has to get seated as well. But one of my favorite political scientists, Adam Pravorsky, has a binary definition of democracy. And did you have an election? Did the incumbent lose? And did the winner of the election form the next government? If you've got those three things, then you've got a democracy. The word peaceful transition does not appear in Adam's definition, but from that perspective, and just linking it back to Schrodinger's cat, the wave function collapses, and we observe one state of the many possible, and at least for Adam, provided that transition does take place, you've got a democracy in the United States. There's a live question, I think, as well, and again, one we need to come back to. I heard it put very poignantly by an American commentator over the last couple of days. Can America be a functioning multiracial democracy? I think that's a very poignant, powerful way of, I think, of putting, what this has been really all about fundamentally, and not just the last 4 years, by the way, but you might even ask, certainly since the Civil War. I think that is, to some extent, perhaps an question about the Republic that we might get back to, perhaps in another webinar. Bruce, I hope that there's some highfalutin stuff to tee it up for you. I'm wondering about your reflections on the last couple of weeks, months, years. Swing at that however you see fit in light of the comments from both Jen and Gorana, and perhaps myself as well. And indeed, it might be time to start pivoting towards the future, what it portends for the sorts of, what we're going to see over the next days and weeks out of Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much, and thanks to, great to have Gorana and Jen with us along with Simon, so thank you. If we think about the webinars that we had, the sessions with our audience over the past months, A real issue going into the election was, could America's democracy survive Trump's reelection? And President Obama warned explicitly about that at the Democratic convention, and I thought it was a very powerful message. I tweeted somewhat humorously, I said, well, if Trump had won re-election and the Democrats had held the House, he'd be impeached again in the second term. We didn't have to wait for the second term. And what occurred was really a scary moment but the institutions held, as Janet Garana said. But in talking with many in Washington, friends and colleagues, and many Republicans in Washington, the longer they absorb what happened on the 6th of January, the angrier they get. And because of the profound threat it represented to a functioning democracy, the Congress fulfilling its constitutional responsibilities. And this is where Mitch McConnell becomes very, very important. He's done with Trump. He was done with Trump. It started with the disagreements over the third COVID package just before Christmas, when Trump tried to upend it with his demands. But it was sealed absolutely. And then when McConnell made his judgment about the Electoral College, that in fact the purpose of the joint session was to ratify the Electoral College. And then what happened? And then overnight, we had a statement from him that he believes that Trump did provoke the mob to attack the Capitol, which says to me that he's prepared to convict in the Senate trial. And I believe the Senate trial will occur later next week. I believe Biden wants, and I think the Democrats want, Schumer, Nancy Pelosi want to give some clear air over these next very consequential days from the moment of swearing in for at least the principal officers of the cabinet to go through their confirmation hearings and have them in place. And we had 5 confirmation hearings going on today, including Tony Blinken, Janet Yellen, and so forth. Very, very important. And then when that is done, I think what they will reach agreement on is a sort of bifurcated schedule where some of the day is for the impeachment trial and some of the day is for processing government business. And in fact, most of the government business will go in the House first, and then it'll be presented to the Senate, and that will be worked through. So I think that works. I think it'll be a short trial, but I think what McConnell has flagged will signal that actually the votes may be there to convict Trump. If he votes to convict, that the others will, there will be critical mass. But we'll just have to see how that unfolds. But what we will immediately have, and it gets to the question of what kind of country it is today. And I think, Simon, you're right. The Civil War is with us in ways that we kind of wish it wasn't still 150 years later. And I think that's the shocking realization from what happened at the Capitol. It's not over. And so it gets to, well, how ingrained is this among those who did vote for Trump? And I agree with Garana, I believe, or Jen, I'm sorry, that about half I think are fluid, but half are really locked in, hardcore. And then how do those attitudes change over time? And I think that depends in terms of how President Biden comports himself and what he's able to do in leadership and how the Congress responds to what he wants to do and to address problems so that people feel less alienated, less disenfranchised, less left behind in whatever modern America is today. Biden will have, I believe, in the first 100 days, I see 5 priorities, and I think he's been very clear about it. It's going to be COVID and controlling the pandemic and then ending it with the vaccine program and having that in place. And then, right in partnership with it, reviving the economy. So the two are absolutely linked. And he already announced what his recovery plan is. He announced that on Friday, $1.9 trillion. There are a lot of other elements in there that are not basic to recovery as far as how Republicans view it, like what the minimum wage is and so forth. So that's an issue. But that's number 1 and number 2 linked. I think he wants to fix the holes in Obamacare because obviously people have fallen through that, and that's a legacy issue from Obama and Biden together. And then number 4, racial justice and voting rights. I believe that was H.R. 1, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, pending. And 5th, climate change, and elevating that and then moving on that. And then he will also introduce, I believe on the first day, an immigration bill to take care of DACA and other legacy issues on immigration, where the border is and how immigrants and those seeking asylum have been treated. So and what I think he wants to do, given everything that he said about wanting to be bipartisan, outreach and so forth, which he got flayed for in the primaries. You remember Kamala Harris attacked him for having for dealing with senators who were very conservative and racist with some of them, but he talked with them because he wanted to get things done. Anyway, he wants to see whether, in fact, given the narrow margins in the Senate, in the House and the Senate, you can do business with Republicans. And I think a signal of the possibility here on this first 100-day agenda, which actually has to be seen, particularly on COVID and the economy, as pragmatic, responsible, middle of the road programs, just to get things, basic things done, that he saw in the lead up to the last COVID relief package, the leadership in the House and the Senate deadlocked, and Trump, of course. So Pelosi and McConnell were not working together. It was stuck. It had been stuck for months. How big are the relief checks? Can we get it done? And what happened was members on both the House and Senate, in both parties, farther down in the ranks, felt the urgency, the fierce urgency of now to get something done because the country is in agony. And they produced the package that became the basis for what was ultimately enacted. That is the model by which success can occur. When Obama was elected in 2009, his margin in the House was 39 votes. I worked in the House at that time. We knew on Obamacare, on cap and trade, energy and climate, anything was brought to the floor, we could lose 39 votes from conservative Democrats, the blue dogs, and still win. And so that was the calculation. So you tailor your bill to get most of what you want, but you realize you give members an out who have difficulty dealing with some of those issues at home, but you get it through. And in the Senate, he had 59 senators that went to 60 for a period of time and then back to 59. So Obama was in an extraordinarily fortunate situation in the Senate. But still, he couldn't get cap and trade through. He did get Obamacare through, and through a special process called reconciliation. And if you really want to get into the weeds, we can do that later, and I'll bring my lawnmower out and we'll get into the weeds on reconciliation. So what he has now is a 6-vote margin in the House. And I know from direct experience, there's no better vote counter and manager than Speaker Pelosi and the chairs. So the model of getting stuff through the House is you divide the packages into their committees of jurisdiction. They work it in their committees. They get a consensus in the committee, get all the Democratic votes, put it together, take it to the floor. And before it ultimately goes to the floor for a vote, you work out any rough spots. And that's how you pass bills in the House. And that's what we will see over the next 100 days. And the Senate, 50-50 and Kamala Harris, 51, nowhere close to having a filibuster-proof majority. And this is where that bipartisan model comes in. So even when you're successful passing the House, it's going to be changed in the Senate to make it even more moderate and more down to earth and less generous and so forth on various things, or less aggressive on climate change and immigration and other issues. And so it is a real test, but I have no doubt from listening to Biden, and particularly the people that he's appointed, I think just an expert cabinet and staff. I mean, they're just really good. A lot of people say, well, they're all Obama people. They're going to repeat all the Obama mistakes. I think humans are a little more intelligent than that, and I think they learn from the past, and I think they'll be better. But the whole one important aspect of Biden, as far as public perceptions are concerned, is he's always underestimated. Right? He could never win the primaries. He could never become a great nominee. He could never campaign in his basement. He could never choose a great vice president. You know, he was always going to not be able to do it. Well, guess who's getting inaugurated tomorrow? And his approval rating is higher than Trump has ever achieved during his presidency. So I think those are the things to watch for in these first 100 days. Can they keep the Democrats together and show open windows for Republican support on pragmatic, responsible, middle-of-the-road policies that will get the job done? And if the job is done, and that means a vaccine program that really works really quickly, in relative terms, and then unleash the economy, and then people will feel, what does he want? More normal. So we have a democracy that functions kind of like we knew it kind of sort of did. And I think that would be really, if he can do that, I think that would be really good. He comes in with goodwill. And he is, in any other year, no way he would have been nominated. It would have been somebody else. But this is a real time when the person meets history and history meets the person. And this is it for now. And just one other thing, the mood. I wrote today in the Herald and the Age about it. This really strikes me as like 1933. The country is in agony. It's on its prostrate before itself and the world. A lot of people wonder, is America a failed state because of how they could not handle the pandemic? And people are looking for leadership. And Biden, he knows this and he wants to provide it. He will also, I think we'll see one of the shortest inaugural speeches in history. And I think that's also what people want. And they just want to get the job done. And I think he will do that consistent with the values that took him to the nomination, but not in a way that crams it down the throats of people who have doubts about where the country is going. So that's a lot and a lot of hope. And maybe he will stumble and maybe we will be really, really stuck. But I think that's how this is going to start. And the next few weeks are going to be really, really interesting.
I agreed with the next couple of weeks being interesting. There's a lot there, Bruce. I want to come back to it and unpack a lot of that, if I can, and some questions before we open it up to the hundreds who have joined us online. Jen, I'm wondering, are you I detected some optimism from Bruce there, suffice to say, about Biden's ability to broker the coalitions he's going to need in both chambers to make headway. I'm wondering if you had any reactions to that, given, what you're tracking, particularly on the Republican side and the base and that very pro-Trump part of the Republican base. Is there any give at all among Republicans in Congress to play ball on perhaps COVID relief is probably the easiest of the list of legislative initiatives, but I'd be very curious your assessment of the prospects of even a scintilla of bipartisanship over the next days, weeks, and months.
Well, it's a great question. And I think the Republican Party is fracturing a bit. And we're going to see that most immediately around the impeachment trial that happens in the next week or so. You had the third highest ranking Republican, Liz Cheney, coming out in support of impeachment in the House, calling Trump's actions to incite the insurrection, the most gravest, active sedition and violation of oath of office. Interestingly, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had a similar statement calling the actions at the Capitol building sedition and insurrection. And already there have been some exercises in vetting some of the guard that is around Biden and those people dismissed for, quote, domestic terrorist sympathies. So I think we underestimate the appeal and penetration of these conspiracy theories at our peril. I think it has proven successful as an electoral strategy for the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party has, over the last few years, celebrated and rewarded the most extreme fringes of its own party. Remember, Ted Cruz was almost the nominee in 2016. He started as a Tea Partier. He read Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham in the middle of the Senate to stop funding for a health program for healthcare. These positions are ideologically extreme in terms of peer nations. And this was pointed out very poignantly in a great book by Norman Ornstein, congressional scholar, and Thomas Mann in 2012 called It's Even Worse Than You Think. And at that point, they had already identified the Republican Party was an insurgent outlier, contemptuous of facts, unconvinced of the legitimacy of its opposition. And so we see those dynamics playing out, but they're very long-standing. They predate Trump, and they will outlive Trump as well. So I think we need to be very cautious that this will change the tone in Congress or change the base of the Republican Party. given how deeply and widely some of these conspiracy theories have penetrated into the lower levels, that we now see active military or retired military participating in some of this insurrection and sedition, law enforcement wearing militia symbols, 3%er patches, and these are going to take massive reform at the state and local level. There's only so much that Congress can do on its own. And I think the Republican Party fracturing will only hinder some of that development as this becomes, sort of an interscene conflict within the party and between the parties as well.
Thanks, Jen. Grant, essentially same question to you. In light of sort of our opening remarks about the current state of American democracy, and go ahead and invoke Schrodinger's cat again if you want. But the pathway that Bruce sort of sketched there, the legislative agenda, just wondering, your assessment of its prospects for success. But, I keep coming back to, and I'll come back to Bruce on this one in a moment, a 50-50 Senate, there is no margin.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be very tough. And obviously, we are seeing now that there's been this kind of coalition or the caucus for some sort of bipartisanship that has emerged, at least in the Senate. So at least some, if you want to be hopeful, some reasons to be optimistic. But I would say that Biden, obviously, with this plan for both the stimulus and the idea of building back better has a lot of ground to actually bring along those Republicans that might not be necessarily in political jeopardy if they come along. So I'm thinking about projects that we've heard about, like infrastructure that's always talked about, right? And that was something that was supposed to allegedly be a kind of ground for compromise back in the lead up to 2018 midterms, the whole Pelosi and Schumer meeting with Trump and all that. But obviously that didn't materialize. But at the same time, we know that the kind of twin pressures of both climate change and the response to the economic crisis that has emanated out of the coronavirus pandemic, that they provide this sort of imperative to think about this. So I would say that those would be maybe kind of specific issues where you could see some coming along. And I think that more broadly then with some of these initiatives that don't necessarily focus on particular areas of the United States, but that can be seen more as a really kind of a federal response through the kind of public works or investment in that sense, that they could, in a way at least, help legitimize Biden in the eyes of those who have supported Donald Trump in the past election. Because again, your question on whether we can see a functioning multiracial democracy, and this question of how do you actually reconcile a country that's so deeply divided? And this is where kind of my two worlds come colliding, the kind of question of transitional justice, even where you obviously are in this sort of state where, having justice precludes having peace, or having peace obviously doesn't give you justice, and what will be a kind of grand bargain there. And whether, in pursuing some of these policies that are seen as, again, benefiting the many, could be seen at least a way to move forward. Again, I'm not being naive at all about the kind of fringes that will remain and that will pose serious threat moving forward, and that this is something that, didn't just come with Donald Trump. Let's not fool ourselves. We have plenty of our colleagues who are historians around the university, even on this very floor, who point to the post-Reconstruction era and White League and all the rest. But really, to kind of think about these policies that can be seen at least to speak to the broader public. And Biden, again, with his message with inauguration, is signaling that he is a uniter, unlike his predecessor.
Bruce, I want to pick up on that and come back to you to you know, the legislative agenda you sketched, and just picking up on Jen and Garana's assessments, you know, the 1.9 trillion in COVID relief, you know, I think that you know, I would think that's first cab off the rank and probably the easiest thing to get through. But you mentioned HR1, voting rights, racial justice. I wonder if they go off to the Senate to die, and moreover, Bruce, I want to put to you sort of a sketch of the next couple of weeks in American politics, and that is an impeachment trial, no matter how short, just gets the backup of the Republican base, and the pressure coming on to Republican senators to play ball, and even on, you know, some Democratic senators. Thinking West Virginia is always sort of the first one that pops to mind. A red state, but with a blue senator there, a Democratic senator. How much of this sort of more expansive, progressive, frankly, agenda is there appetite for there, and how do you get it past the filibuster?
I'll come back to the filibuster later, but I think if you get the super urgent stuff that, again, is just very pragmatic and everyone needs, COVID and a recovering economy, get that done, you get into a rope-a-dope situation and dealing with the Republicans, and then you come back to that to deal with them on harder issues. But you have a good working relationship. Trust becomes very important. Impeachment trial aside, we have two different things affecting the atmosphere. First, Trump is not on Twitter. And before he was knocked off of Twitter, I was afraid, I knew what he was going to do. At 12:02 p.m., there would be the Trump Twitter burst against Biden's inaugural speech. That will not happen. That isn't going to happen. It's not happening now. So there's clearer air for Biden than there would have been otherwise. And as far as Republicans are concerned, by him being off stage and off platform, it means that they have more discretion in what they want to do on these legislative packages than if Trump was calling the shots. And we saw a rebellion against that, I said, on the last COVID package. But it means that Trump's pronouncements on what he would like to see or agrees with or doesn't agree with are not automatically the Republican positions on the Hill. And so that gives them more flexibility, and that's a very good thing. But then the other thing affecting the atmosphere, though, is, okay, what happens in 2022? And if you're really hard-headed about it in the Republican Party, you say to yourself, wow, we gained a lot of seats in this election that we were supposed to lose. And so we're only 6 seats from a majority. That's the smallest majority in decades. Yeah. So if we play hardball, if we play hardball and deny Biden victories and he becomes a do-nothing president, guess what? We have a better chance of taking back the House and the Senate. So there are opportunities because the atmosphere is clearer, and also challenges because a pull in a different direction. Why do this? Because power can be ours. So, you know, if you were all in with Trump in 2020, you were all out of power today as a Republican. So what do you want to do to get that power back? So that is a difficult, you know, there's going to be a moment of honesty for everyone. Is Biden up to it? Does he know? Can he unlock the doors? And what's waiting for him on the other side? And when he extends his hand, are they going to grasp it? I think it's going to be really interesting to see. We'll know very soon whether this model works. On the other hand, just coming back to impeachment, I mean, yeah, a trial, and, you know, there's no reputable lawyer who wants to defend the president in this impeachment trial. So I don't know who's going to defend him. But what happens if he says, I want to testify in my own defense? And he comes to the Senate and he sits there and takes questions. It's not, I was thinking about this earlier, it's not a Perry Mason moment. It's not or Tom Cruise, you know, in A Few Good Men or whatever it is. The senators don't ask questions directly. All the questions go through the presiding officer, which may not be the Chief Justice. It probably will be, I think, Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who's the new Senate President pro tem, the elder in the Senate. I don't think the Chief Justice wants to do it for a former president. Kamala Harris would be next in line. That's a clear conflict of interest, and I don't think she wants to be in that position. So I think it would come to the highest ranking figure in the Senate. But all questions from senators to whoever is giving evidence goes through. So a senator doesn't get up, it doesn't have the chance to stand up and lecture Donald Trump on the Senate floor and ask him leading questions. It'll come through, so it'll have some decorum. But if that's the way it unfolds, it'll be a spectacle unlike that we've never seen before.
Bruce, oh wow, I hadn't thought through. But let me ask you, does the Chief Justice have discretion to not preside?
Well, they will agree. I think he does. Again, if he was a sitting president, there's no question about it. But precedents will be set in this new situation. And I think the I think the leadership wants, what do they want? A quick, orderly trial. And I think they will accommodate whatever works. So if there's an agreement between Schumer and McConnell on the structure of the trial, that will stick, and I think that'll be just fine.
Last question, Bruce, before we flip to audience questions. A filibuster reform.
Yes.
Always talked about, seldom realized. And feel free to talk about how filibuster intersects with budget reconciliation, if you so dare.
I will. I'll dare briefly. The filibuster, which is a supermajority to cut off debate, started as something that was really rarely used, a privilege that senators would resort to, and for momentous occasions like the civil rights bills in the 60s. But over time, as hyperpartisanship has gripped Washington, the filibuster is now standard. Any piece of legislation needs 60 votes to proceed. And so it's just a fact of life. And people, it's like having a nuclear weapon. You're not going to give it up, so that you keep it. There is, to get around it a little bit on major issues, there is in the Budget Act something called a reconciliation process, whereby provisions in a budget bill can go to the Senate, and it's only a simple majority, 51, to approve or not approve. But there are strict rules, something called the Byrd Rule, after Robert Byrd, legendary leader from West Virginia, established as to what could go into the budget bill so that it could have 51 votes. And that means what went in couldn't just be anything. It had to be really tailored to a fiscal issue, a budget issue, numbers rather than policy. You can't make wholesale changes. You can't rewrite the Constitution. You can't do major stuff in it, but you can get a lot done on the budget side. Now, people are looking at this process, and I've consulted with some people who worked for Republican leaders in the Senate, and how the Byrd Rule is applied comes down to rulings from the chair as to whether something in a reconciliation bill fits or doesn't fit with the Budget Act. And if you have a ruling from the chair that, yeah, we can take this overhaul of Obamacare and put it into the bill, right, and we can do something really significant on climate change, and we can do a lot on COVID and so forth. If it survives a parliamentary challenge on the Senate floor, and that's a simple majority vote, 51, right, that you can actually get it done. So that's one big trick to pull off. But the other big trick is to put something in that the House will take as well. And if it's, again, ultra aggressive, you're going to lose some conservative Democrats. If it's not aggressive enough, or you're going to lose some liberal Democrats. So it's a huge balancing act, but there is a way to thread the needle. What I think will happen is that Biden will go through the regular process. We have this urgent economic agenda. We have this urgent COVID relief and vaccination program. We're putting it to the Senate. If they fail, then I think he says to the American people, they have failed. I'm doing the best that I can. Here are all the compromises I offered. The American people want it. You want it. You want your vaccines. You want more economic relief. You want something in your paychecks, jobs. So this is it. And that's how he'll use the pressure. So yes, it can be done. It hasn't been done, but there may come its moment. Okay.
That's some deep inside baseball.
Yeah, sorry.
And why we haven't, he literally does know more about the workings of the US Congress than anyone on the Australian landmass. Let's turn to some audience questions. I'm just looking at the time. We are 10 of the hour, and we are scheduled to run a little past, a little longer today with the variety of guests and the enormity of the topic we're trying to take on. An hour. We're not constrained to an hour. Look, we've got confirmation hearings underway already. Literally this morning, our time, afternoon, DC time, Tony Blinken, Biden's nominee for Secretary of State, was testifying before the Senate. He was asked a question directly. Did he agree with Lindsey Graham's characterization of what's going on against Uyghurs in China as genocide? And Blinken said he did not disagree with Lindsey Graham's characterization. Just wondering from Garana, Jen, your sense of, again, raises a big question about the nature of China policy that we're likely to see out of a Biden administration. But again, looking at appointments or reading of tea leaves, sort of what you're seeing, perhaps either out of that testimony or out of the appointments, early takeouts on the direction of Biden foreign policy, perhaps, with a view to Australia's national interests as well. Garana, why don't you take a swing at that if you so choose?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just jogging around Glebe Bay with my dog and listening to Tony Blinken's testimony.
That's living. That is living Garana.
Multitasking and living my best life, indeed. Yeah, it was actually really well, it was quite amazing to listen just to Tony Blinken agreeing with so much with Lindsey Graham. And that came actually to Lindsey Graham's surprise as well. He said that he would vote for his confirmation, obviously, and threw in also some references to Joe Nye and soft power, and how all the bullets can't necessarily buy you what soft power can, and so on. You can't go all in with hard power. But apart from the kind of references to IR bards, it was very interesting to hear the incoming Secretary of State deliver some early sketches of where the administration will go. Obviously, all of us who are in the foreign policy analysis space over the past couple of months have been divining what the future will hold, and going through every possible opinion piece or an essay published by everyone and anyone on the National Security Council or within the foreign policy bureaucracy. In terms of some of these issues that you specifically flagged, Simon, so US-China policy, we obviously know that the relations are now firmly in this strategic competition phase. This is not going to change. We are going to see a continuation from the Trump era in that sense, in the general orientation. But we know, obviously, even though the strategic assessment might be similar, the tactics, the strategy will change drastically. And as you already flagged, this is where alliance politics will come really to the fore. So bringing along in a more meaningful way both the allies in here in this region, Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, whatever you might want to call it, and we'll see also that jargon, what happens with it coming in. We know that some friends of Australia are already tapped to head some of the kind of key or be at the helm of the policy, such as Kurt Campbell, who was previously at the state and who famously had a lot of disagreements with the way that the Obama administration had centralized the decision-making on foreign policy within the National Security Council. Now he's going to be basically within this system as a czar for the region. But also we know that the kind of resuscitation of transatlantic alliance will bring with it additional leverage vis-a-vis China, especially. We are yet to see, obviously, what exactly those kind of nuances are going to be. I think one of the big questions that we are yet to see, and kind of we will know more again once the administration comes in, once we see really some of the policy memos and first decisions come out. I think decoupling is probably where I've seen most disagreements coming into the administration. So where some have been arguing that basically technological separation is impossible, except perhaps in a very small number of sensitive technologies, but others say that the US really and the West more collectively should be pushing further into separating critical infrastructure and even other parts of the economy. On that final point around this decision that one of the last actually decisions of the Trump administration, and I've seen that there have been some questions around labeling China's actions in Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs as genocide. Words do matter, and especially, you know, as a student of ethnic politics, when we call things genocide, that obviously carries that historical weight. But then it begs the question, what will be done about it? And this is obviously the critical question in international relations. This is where 1648 and 1948 come colliding, right? The Treaty of Westphalia, which basically enshrines this norm of sovereignty of states, versus 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the protection of every single life, right, that the United Nations has been committed to, and obviously various treaties and conventions on human rights that have come out of that. We know that the 90s have brought the norm of humanitarian intervention, of responsibility to protect. We know that it's been tested, and you know, there have been very, very mixed results, obviously, over the past 2 decades. But what is happening in Xinjiang province is clearly something that the international community, if it does label that as a genocide, then has to come up with the next step, what is going to be done about it, right? Punitive measures, actions that basically prevent further atrocities or violence from happening. So that's you know, something that, you know, the incoming administration might agree with, which is what Tony Blinken has said. But again, it begs the question, what next?
Thanks, Grana. Jen, just wondering, any reflections from you on that? The other thing that Blinken said was that so much of American foreign policy and its power abroad, you know, comes through what, you know, in the academy we might call soft power channels, and that is, you know, America's standing in the world, and that begins by repairing, you know, what Blinken, you know, the crises currently confronting America domestically. Just wondering, you know, how you see this balance between needing to deal with domestic crises, just that dashboard blinking as red as you're ever going to see, with also this ferocious appetite from allies and friends for a return to American leadership through appointments, international fora and whatnot. Just wondering your reflections on, you know, those many competing policy priorities confronting the new administration, and perhaps how some of the proposed appointments speak to those.
Sure. So I think the Biden administration will need to engage in a bit of a comeback tour in regards to its allies. I expect that Australia will not have to wait more than a year to be appointed an ambassador under the Biden administration, as it was forced to wait under the Trump administration. I expect to see some changes in how appointments are selected relative to the Trump administration. First of all, I don't think we can expect many people named Biden to be joining the ranks of White House officials. Remember, Trump appointed his children as White House officials. They were given security clearances. They sat in the big chair for the U.S. At G8 meetings. So I think we can already see a shift from sort of a family-oriented, financially based policy to one that's sort of divorced from those conflicts of interest. Remember, Biden doesn't own a stock. He promised early on in his congressional career not to have that sort of conflict of interest, so he's not burdened by those now. When I was walking my dog this morning, was listening to the testimony of Avril Haines. So clearly, Garana are both living our best lives as political science nerds this morning. And I think what she said was very poignant for what the Trump administration, the Biden administration should focus on in contrast to the Trump administration. And she was talking about doing away with the politicization of intelligence that has been occurring over the last few years. We have a whistleblower account at the Department of Homeland Security saying that Trump intentionally instructed intelligence officials to minimize the threat of white supremacy, to minimize the threat of white nationalism in their reports. We had funding stripped from researchers on those same topics of far-right extremism. So I think we can see some of those tools restored to fight those challenges. But I think what the Biden administration is going to focus on is going to be COVID, the 3 C's, right? COVID-19, climate change, and corruption. I think this is a big plank that can get a lot of Americans behind it. And that would also push out into the foreign policy realm as well. So we saw various policies and tools around the Maginski Act in Congress and other Democratic policies over the last few years. So I think this is a powerful platform that will allow them to marry the domestic focus as well as international reputation rebuilding in light of some of the damage that's been done.
Bruce, I want to sort of see if I can get a congressional lens on some of this stuff. With the domestic crises just commanding, such urgency at the moment. It seems to me at the best of times, foreign policies, is very much a sort of below the fold issue, particularly perhaps over on the House side. I think senators with 6-year terms can perhaps build careers, perhaps burnishing their credentials for a presidential run through sort of, engaging with the tools of statecraft, particularly through some of those big prestigious Senate committees. But just what's the appetite for, say, defense spending, investment in those things that project American presence and frankly power abroad at a time where you led off with 4 or 5 domestic policy items as being sort of the top of the tree,
right,
on a legislative agenda.
Right. The first thing, though, I want to say in response to Garana, if Tony Blinken can get Lindsey Graham to vote for him, I think there's hope for a deal with North Korea and Iran. So I'm kind of optimistic about where we're headed here. Yes. Let's just take some hot spots and just go through. Putin, much more aggressive attitude towards Russia, Ukraine, everything is there. The Mideast, take what you can from the Abraham Accords, but then more balance on the Palestinian issues and how they're resolved. I'll come to China in a moment. Iran and North Korea, it's clear that they want to re-engage with Iran and see how far they can get. North Korea will be a completely different ballgame. There is not going to be any summit between Biden and Kim Jong-un unless he's willing to surrender his nuclear weapons. So that's not going to happen. And then, but he's really, we don't know what Kim is going to do. So that is a really, really dangerous situation. But China, and as you've report that's it. And I think the posture is, from what I could glean from the hearings, but also leading up to this, was that Trump absolutely identified the correct issues. Those are in the relationship. They have to be resolved. It's not right. It's not stable economically. It's not stable strategically. And so how you do it, and I think going back to the points made by Garana and Jen on multilateralism and so forth, you rebuild the alliances in Asia and in Europe, and you roll up to China with your friends, and you engage with added leverage from your friends being with you. And I think it really comes down to a pretty serious discussion. Okay, what do we want the next 10 years to look like? And how far can that go? But with, and more emphasis on human rights. This morning, Blinken spoke about the Uyghurs and the situation, the terrible things that they are enduring. Human rights in Hong Kong becomes important. And then on the strategic side, Taiwan is the thing that no one wants to contemplate what happens if, in fact, China moves to absorb it into the mainland. And frankly, no one really knows, A, if they will do that, but then B, what it really means for everyone once that happens. Is it war? Does it mean that Asia turns into Europe post the Cold War in Europe, that goes on for 30 years? So that has to be faced. But so there's this, so I guess, Simon, there's this underlay of the international issues below the domestic agenda, but given the heft of the national security team that has been assembled, it will be present throughout, very visible, get a lot of his attention. And he wants to travel. I mean, he will go to NATO meetings because he wants to. And I expect, I agree with Jen, we'll have an ambassador here, but I'm sure he wants to come to Australia too. He has people around him that are very close to Australia, from Kurt Campbell to Bruce Reed, Deputy Chief of Staff as well. And so I see a lot of activity by Biden directly, hands-on. He knows these leaders. He's known them for decades, and he likes dealing with them. So I see that involvement as being very important.
Hey, Bruce, just putting your DC insider hat on for a moment, the Campbell appointment as a policy coordinator for Indo-Pacific, parenthesis China, how does, if you're the
Assistant Secretary of State for Asia?
Yeah, over in the State Department, like, how does this not become I mean, you're always going to have bureaucratic turf wars as the, new kids look to really shine in the administration and whatnot. There's always an element of that in any organization, particularly, the US government, perhaps as big an organization as that. But just your sense of that appointment, and perhaps even a similar remark about the Kerry appointment on climate. Is this where, good intentions go to die, or how do these things work or not work in your experience?
First, there are shared values as to what the policy is. I don't see policy disagreements. I think they are turf disagreements. But then you have very able people managing them, from Tony Blinken, of course, Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, who is just so important. She spoke with us a few months ago. And so on Iran, that she will, given her direct involvement in those negotiations, very important. I mean, Kurt Campbell is absolutely a political animal. And he does understand the virtues of working together and the dangers of not working together. But Joe Biden doesn't want his team divided that would undercut his achievement of his objectives. And I think then I think that's where Ron Klain and Steve Ricchetti and Tom Donilon come in and say, we're not going to have this nonsense. And they're not, if you start reading about on the front page of the Washington Post that Kurt Campbell's having troubles with the State Department, that's really bad news. And B, that will not happen again. So I think this is where I think they're smarter than they were 8 years ago. And I think we will see real growth and real. So yes, I'm going to be, on the day of the inauguration, yes, I'm going to be an optimist, okay? We can talk in 6 months to see where it all goes.
All right. Hey, in the time remaining, a lot of the questions that we've got are back on, I'm just scrolling through some of them, are back on domestic matters and some of the political drama. We'll see. I'll try and hold those to the end. But Jen and Garana, and Bruce, I might come back to you on this one. One thing that gets talked about a lot is daylight opening up between the United States and Australia on a particularly important issue, and that's climate change. And again, there's the Kerry appointment announced very early on, sort of a signal of intent. Biden's essays over 2020, ahead of the election, with this aspiration to put climate change considerations at the heart of American foreign policy, American security policy. a lot of people went, yeah, that's great. And then when he didn't have the Senate, people thought the ability for that to translate into action was going to be considerably diminished. Now, with Democrats, with Harris at the tie-breaking vote, and subject to all the caveats we were sounding about the tenuous nature of that Senate majority, now that seems to have a little more reality perhaps to it. I'm interested in either of you, perhaps Jen, if you want to start first on this. Your read of both the domestic climate, no pun intended, for realizing that Biden aspiration of putting climate change at the center of everything, and where that might go in terms of policy and implications for Australia. And again, in the context of just an exceptionally crowded policy agenda in Washington at the moment.
So I was flipping back through my photos earlier this month. You know, where was I? What was I doing in January 2020? And of course, Australia was on fire. So there I am in a mask in Canberra on January 1st because the air quality is 23 times higher than the hazardous level. And I think climate change was really anticipated to be the story of 2020 before COVID hit. And I think that has catapulted climate change into sort of the consciousness of people who didn't feel it personally impacted them before. But I also think it's some of the electoral successes we've seen for the Democratic Party around this issue are linked to the greater understanding of climate change and demographic change in general. So this is the first election, 2020 was the first election in which millennials were the largest voting bloc in the United States. So this is not shorthand for kids these days. Confession, I'm a millennial. So this is the birth year of 1981 to 1996. This was named for the high school graduating class of 2000. That's why we're called millennials. But millennials are the first generation in which a supermajority understand climate change and its challenges for their quality of life. So I think this is a major driver, that demographic shift, people demanding action on this issue, the demonstration of those negative consequences. And I think that the pressure that Biden would put on Australia would only mirror the pressure that's coming from the Australian public as well. We have a vast majority of Australians agreeing that climate change is a problem and it should be an issue. Now, at the moment, we have a little respite in the weather due to La Nina, but this is a temporary situation, and thus the fires will resume again next summer. So I think this issue isn't going away. Its consequences are becoming vividly clear to everyone around the world, and that we can expect pressure from the Australian public as well as the Biden administration to work together on climate issues, which are, you know, generating of jobs, they harness new technology, so they are economically beneficial as well as protective of the planet.
Grana, again, your knowledge, expertise with respect to the European allies as well might be relevant here, but same question for you, your thoughts about this Biden aspiration of putting climate change considerations at the heart and center of a lot of externally focused US policy.
Look, we find ourselves living in a country that now risks being the global pariah, basically, when it comes to serious commitment on climate change. And given the changes in leadership in Washington, Australia would be well advised and very wise here, the leadership, to become a bit more ambitious regarding some of these plans, especially on carbon neutrality and so on. What we've seen actually in Australia happening is that some of the businesses and really the investments craving for the kind of targets that really we don't see at the government level. But obviously climate change is an issue that's much greater than just any US president or a change in leadership in DC. And this is something where we see all across the board. And you've mentioned European Union is one of those places that has committed to carbon neutrality by 2050, but so did China, for instance, and Japan and so on. But there is also, again, this comes at a point in time which is vastly different to when Obama entered the office in 2009, when he as well had a pretty ambitious climate change plan, but obviously a lot of the policy bandwidth got really chewed up with the kind of struggle to pass the healthcare bill, and then the inability to come to any sort of meaningful agreement at the Copenhagen summit back in 2009. But these are different times now. The price of what is it? I believe the kind of the energy from solar has gone down around 9 times, right? The wind has gone, the price of using wind energy around 40–50%. All of these renewables now are way more competitive than they were just a decade ago. And this is now an opportunity again where you see really the markets dictating that change as well. And we find ourselves at a time when prices of hydrocarbons are pretty much, or have been on the decline. This is something that, is both a positive, but also from a geopolitical perspective, something that we should also keep an eye on in terms of the potential for instability to arise in countries that are heavily dependent on hydrocarbons, especially oil there. So it's again, it's an issue that transcends just one person in the White House, and we are seeing some promising early signals again in terms of Biden's direction, both at home. Again, this talk of building back better to basically be connected with what were the ambitions of that Green New Deal, as well as then acting on the international front in concert with others to basically see what we hope will be a reversal and a decrease on those metrics that are very concerning every single year. 2020 was the hottest year after 2016 on record. So we can only hope we continue going there. And again, markets tend to be going towards the direction as well.
Bruce, I didn't see anything directly on climate change again in your opening list of 4, 5, 6.
No, I did mention it. It was climate change is a top first 100-day priority, no question. So
what's likely to get done other than something he'll do within minutes of being inaugurated, and that is rejoining Paris? But
they'll rejoin Paris, and they'll repeal as many of the Trump deregulatory actions as possible, and then they'll put a legislative package together. As far as Australia is concerned, I think given the relationship, they will listen very politely to what the Australian government has to say on the pace and scope of climate change, and say, we'll see you down the road. And so I always felt that the biggest impact on what is done by the Biden administration will be felt here in Australia, and will affect Australia's domestic political debate on climate. And that'll be the biggest impact. But the US is not going to wait. John Kerry is not going to wait for Prime Minister Morrison or Prime Minister Albanese to get together with him on climate. That the horse is gone from that barn.
What do you assess as being the chance? I mean, if I were to pick an issue that has is in deep political trouble on Capitol Hill, it'd be movement on climate change. And indeed, a lot of Democrats, no offense, Grant, but say anything other than Green New Deal. Like that's to the extent we're talking about that's how we lose our 6 seats at the midterm. I'm just wondering your assessment of that, and handing kind of responsibility to a former Secretary of State, but giving a, sort of signaling this is an up and out thing, or an executive orders he can do. But I'm just thinking, climate change in Capitol Hill, not a place I'd imagine, that intersection, I think, is that a null? Is that an empty intersection? Is where I'm going with that.
I really want to hear from Garana and Jen on this, but Biden wants to put it forward as a jobs program. In other words, we're creating a whole new sector of the economy, and that's where it works for middle America. And I think it'll be structured in that way. So a whole bunch on executive orders and
Sure.
regulation repeal, but then when it's going to, so the attraction of infrastructure, it's the same kind of attraction in terms of building new jobs in new economies that work.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't we, with the time remaining, let me arc back real quickly to this array of questions we've got about it's a very simple question. Again, I get it a lot. What's the point of an impeachment trial after Trump is no longer president? Number one, is it constitutional? Number two, what's the point? I mean, I think we obsess over this. We know the answers to those questions, but Jen or Garana or anyone want to take a swing at answering those two questions that we've got coming in online today? And again, if you're like me, you get stopped and asked that all the time.
Sure, I'll start.
Sure.
And I would say for those that are interested in a far deeper answer than we can provide in the next few minutes, there's an excellent book called Impeachment by Charles L. Black Jr. That section was written in 1974 in the wake of the Nixon, anticipated impeachment that didn't actually happen. And it was updated in 2018 for absolutely no reason by Philip Bobbitt. So there's two sections of this book, and I'm going to draw just from the original part from the 70s. So these are both preeminent legal scholars. And they note that the purpose of impeachment is not simply punishment, right? You could do that in a criminal trial after the individual has left office. But it's impeachment and conviction if it is anticipated that the wrongdoing will continue. And I think that's really at the heart of this impeachment trial. Yes, it is constitutional to have it after a person has departed, because the second part would potentially bar them from running for office again. So it would only require a simple majority vote once Trump is convicted. If he is convicted, that would bar him from seeking office, for instance, in 2024 or ever again. I will note that as you go through, some of the arguments almost seem quite quaint after the last 4 years that we've seen. In one section, it talks about, income tax evasion being an impeachable offense. Especially if it's using the office to shield one, from liability and accountability. That's a corruption of office. And at any rate, I quote, a large-scale tax cheat is not a viable magistrate, not a viable chief magistrate. So I would say that there's definitely a constitutional basis for impeachment, given that the penalties would impact Trump's ability to run in future, but that does not preclude any criminal, charges or state-based investigations. For instance, in regards to the Trump tapes, where Trump tries to solicit an election official in Georgia to tamper with those election results. So I would say for those who want a more in-depth exploration of this topic, this is the text to start with, but I'm happy to hear from anyone else as well.
That's awesome, Jen. Thanks. Bruce or Grana, anything to add to that?
No, can't improve on the counselor's response. Excellent.
That's right.
Looking for any of the books on the bookshelf, but I do agree. It's a signal to both anyone who potentially would dare to contemplate something similar in the future, but also a signal. We were talking at the very beginning of the webinar about America's credibility in the world. This whole talk of potentially, convening a summit of democracies, which I'm not necessarily a great fan of, simply because, there are going to be greater issues around America's interests at the moment. Not that democracy isn't an important thing, but at the moment, the United States needs to do that restoration at home first before it wants to claim the moral high ground. And one of the ways to do that is to do precisely what has been spelled out by the Constitution. Incitement to insurrection, which is an article of impeachment of Donald Trump's second impeachment, is certainly something that was meant to subvert the democratic order in the United States. And in that way, it does send a powerful message, and it's important to follow it through. Again, going back to what Bruce has said, the Senate will find some way to walk and chew gum at the same time, to do the appointments, to get on with the first 100 days policy agenda, as well as to see this through to the end. And hopefully it's not going to take ages.
Yeah, I don't know if one thing I've just been tracking is quite independently of impeachment and conviction. The 14th Amendment, which is the post-Civil War, right, amendment to the U.S. Constitution, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that anybody who has essentially taken up arms or conspired to take up arms or rebelled, insurrection, sedition against the United States shall not hold any office of, profit, honor, under the United States. And it says that, right? And it's been triggered once where after World War I, Congress cited that provision of the 14th Amendment in declining to seat an elected member of the House of Representatives on the basis of that members, elected yet to be seated members, that prospective members' opposition to American involvement in World War I. And there was no impeachment trial. There was no conviction in the Senate. It was just a majority vote citing the 14th Amendment. I don't know if any of you have been tracking that, but there's been a few articles popping around the internet on there's another vehicle. So Bruce, I guess the question might be, suppose a world there's a trial and suppose it's a 60-40 vote, which isn't sufficient in the Senate. They don't get 17 Republican senators to vote for conviction. They get 8 to 10 or something. Like that, I'm just making up numbers here. Is there appetite nonetheless for a resolution that I think only requires a majority vote to find Trump has violated that provision of the 14th Amendment?
I think because what Garana said, if impeachment fails, they would test that mechanism in the 14th Amendment because people do want reckoning and accountability. So it's not a today issue, but it could be a tomorrow issue if the Senate falls short.
Yeah, really fascinating. A trial. I mean, you just wonder about the political optics. We can't convict him, but nonetheless, we're going to penalize him. And the idea that he might be testifying from the well of the Senate.
I suggest we co-anchor live coverage here at USSC of the Trump testimony.
Might hand that one to you. Hey, that brings us almost to 90 minutes, and so I think we'll call an end of proceedings here. As the conversation and the questions reveal, it's an incredibly full agenda in the US, suffice to say. The crises between the insurrection and COVID, both as a public health and humanitarian matter and an economic matter, and the implications for American power. That's the core business of the United States Study Center at the moment, suffice to say. It's a very busy time for us. It would be in any event with the new administration coming to power, but set against these manifold crises in the United States, we are not having a quiet summer at the United States Study Center by any stretch. And by the numbers that are still with us, 90 minutes into this, nor are you, those of you engaged with the United States, and particularly those of you invested in the US-Australia relationship like us. So thank you for your attention over these 90 minutes today. Thank you for your support of the mission of the United States Study Center. Welcome to an action-packed and a content-packed 2021 from the United States Study Center. My thanks to Bruce, Jen, and Garana. Garana, we will see if we can make the time zones align and engage you from Rome should your NATO engagements permit. That would be, of course, a delight to see more of you online, even though you're going to be far away from us there in Rome, suffering on behalf of the mission of the center, but well done.
Still a pandemic in Europe, Simon. So
yeah, I understand. I understand.
Don't be too jealous, people. It's not like Europe is open or anything.
Yeah, and like me, one of the reflections, like me, I'm sure one of the reflections you've had, that Sydney, Australia, for us at least here in Sydney, hasn't been an altogether too bad a place to be during the middle of a global pandemic. Small blessings in that. Thank you, everybody. We're getting our program for 21 up and running. This is our opening gambit for the year. Thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for another webinar from the United States Study Center in the not too distant future. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to catch all of the latest from the United States Study Center.